Sorry for that break. So this is a movie by Paul Strand and Charles Sheeler called Manhattan. So looking at the industry in cities that are being really growing at an exponential rate and looking at it very visually. So I'll just play a couple minutes of it so you can see what that looks like. Okay. So as you can see in that, there's a lot of the same ideas. In fact, there's actually the same shot of Wall Street that Paul Strand maybe I actually don't know, duplicated or shot at the same time, but this idea of industry and the picturing of a city through that. So what is modernism, right? We've been talking a lot about pictorialism, and where do the differences, where does it start, and why does it start? So you have to imagine, so World War I is going from 1914 to 1918, where 9 million combatants and 7 million civilians died as a result of the war, often called the Great War. The destruction that created in Europe left room for the U.S. to emerge as a new leader in most fields, including art, but also become a world leader throughout the rest of it. So that's one of the reasons why World War I is so important. Also, the Russian Revolution happens in 1917. It was a period of political and social revolution across the Russian Empire that commenced with the abolition of the monarchy. So the overthrowing of the monarchy there, the Tsarist monarchy, and concluding in 1923 when the Bolsheviks took over and the Soviet Union became the USSR. And so it left the Russia to redefine itself as a world power and as an industrial leader, which it had never been before. So back to photography here. Clarence White, who was a self-taught photographer and was one of the co-founders of the photo secession, which we talked about, founded by Stieglitz and people like Steichen and a few others. Um, he taught his first photography courses at Columbia University, at the Teachers College, and then he founded the Clarence H. White School of Photography in New York, teaching many people who would go on to become famous photographers like Margaret Bork White, Paul Outerbridge, Dorothea Lange. All these people are people that I've either talked about or will talk about today or in another lecture. He was remembered as a gifted pictorial photographer, as you can see in this image, who is promoted highly by Stieglitz at the turn of the 20th century. In 1906, he moved from Ohio to New York to work more closely with Stieglitz, but they parted ways in 1910 when Stieglitz turned his back on the pictorial photography to promote modern art, so right around the time of the Armory show. In New York, White began teaching photography and founded his own college by and in 1923 he told the college, "I still have a thrill when I think I'm on the right road, and a little envy when I see a beginner who appears to have arrived." He kind of gave up photographing himself to be a teacher. His legacy leaves no cause for regret. His vision of photography's future was prophetic. His social and aesthetic philosophy was consistent, and his program for training young photographers, which extended far beyond the classroom, was effective. When he died, he was 54. He had succeeded in establishing an institutional network to support artists and their professional ambitions. And in 1920, which were heady times, when he was an avowed socialist, so there was very anti-war, but he helped launch a lot of his students in the careers of magazines like Condé Nast, which you definitely know. Condé Nast is one of the biggest publishers of magazines. They publish things like Vogue and Bon Appetit. I could go on. They publish most magazines that you're familiar with, and so a lot of these photographers that are coming out of this are going into the fashion world, and this is one of his famous pictures called The Bubble. So he's very interested in the mystical. That should have been before. So one of his students is Paul Outerbridge, and his work is very different, where you can see just how he's not teaching students in the way that he photographs. He wasn't teaching them to be pictorialists. He wasn't teaching them otherwise. He was teaching them to be photographers. So Outerbridge was a designer and illustrator in New York before he turned to photography in the 20s. His work was influenced in the commercial field by employing that new direct look of modernism. So this modernism is about very sharp, harsh lines, very graphic. And he had a lot of excitement for technology, so we see all of this coming together. By 1925, he'd established himself as an innovative advertising photographer and graphic designer, where he then moved to Paris and worked for the French edition of Vogue magazine. And he met Edward Steichen there, with whom he developed a friendly rivalry. Here's a little joke for you with some toilet paper, but around 1930, Outerbridge returned to New York and began to experiment with color. In particular, the carbo color process, which I have to admit I'm not that familiar with, but he focused primarily on female nudes, striking full color images that were way ahead of their time. Nobody was using color at this time, and he was producing it. And here is one of these nudes. They're very strange. Sometimes they're a little more straightforward, but this one's a very famous one. It's called Woman with Claws, and the way she's sort of poking into her skin as this representation of violence of some kind, but the color is what stands out mostly. So we go back to Steichen, and you'll remember Steichen was one of the founders of the pictorialist movement. So he was very interested in the art. But by 1911, he made his first fashion photographs, and this actually caused a falling out with Stieglitz for selling out. He then went on. Joined the war effort, and he became the commander of a photo division, photographing during the war. And then actually straight up rejected the pictorial aesthetic and really embraced modernism, which actually Stieglitz would go on to do himself. he also then at one point became the chief photographer for Condé Nast and the head of MoMA. So he had this really illustrious career. Um, and you'll remember some of his pictorialist work. This is called The Pond, Midnight, 1904. So this is before he kind of embraced the modernist aesthetic. This photograph sold in 2006 at auction for close to $3 million. And it also employs a very labor-intensive use of colorization that has made it very rare. So during World War I, he directed this aerial photography for the Army Expeditionary Forces, where soon after doing this, he then would renounce painting altogether, along with the vestiges of pictorialism. So it was really the war effort where he started to see the world from above, photographing these aerial things, seeing these sort of lines and shapes. And then after he returned, he served as the chief photographer for Condé Nast from 1923 to 1938, and on the side would do freelance advertising work. So this is some of his fashion work, which is some of the very first times that we start to see photography being used commercially. So he he was first an innovator of pictorialism, then an innovator of modernism, and then an innovator of fashion photography. And then he actually also went to war in the Second World War as a director of the Department of Photography, and then the Museum of Modern Art. This portrait is of the model Marion Morehouse, which was taken in 1929, which was 6 years after Steichen had assumed the title of chief photographer for Condé Nast. This is a blank slide. Not sure why. I've lost a couple images in here, weirdly. Oh, there we go. I don't know. Sorry about that. So this a wind fire, Teresa Duncan, the adopted daughter of Isadora Duncan, dancing at the Acropolis of Athens. Steichen ensures that the models remain the focal point of the image as he centers the light onto her figure and keeps the backdrop in relative obscurity using shallow depth of field or very stark spaces. Steichen's pictorial roots are evidence in the print's tonal richness and the way he controls the light to emphasize the shimmer and texture of the dresses. Though Steichen didn't invent fashion photography, it was around before, he produced, the images he produced for Condé Nast are often cited as templates for modern fashion photography. And this is a photo that he took of Gloria Swanson, the actress, and you can see how he's really, he's using this sort of pictorial ideas of almost double exposure. It's still about the fabric and about the model. This is product photography, where he made just these Douglas lighters for Walter J. Thompson. He made an award-winning documentary called Fighting Ladies during World War II, and afterwards is when he joined MoMA. And there are his cigarettes. He would photograph celebrities: Greta Garbo, Gary Cooper, Paul Robeson, Marlene Dietrich. And then back to Man Ray. So Man Ray, who we've talked about a lot, has become synonymous with so many facets of art over the years that it's tough to explain his life work in just a few sentences, which is why I'm spreading it out over a couple lectures. He was a bit of an entrepreneur and a crossover artist. So he was a businessman, a filmmaker, a painter, a Dada artist, and a fine art photographer, as well as a fashion photographer. And in these, you see these sort of strange things with this woman in the cart, but also very stark and Steichen-inspired type of work, where we were able to focus a lot on the outfit. Since I don't know what's going on with I'm having some difficulties here, but I'm just going to roll with it. But the image on the right here, you can see where he's really bringing that aesthetic of the surrealism to it. Where it's about the dress, it's about the shapes, the figures. Here is one where he's using his solarization, so very strange stuff, double exposures, but always in the name of fashion. So moving on, out of fashion we get to Bernice Abbott, and the original hipster, very cool lady. Um, but she becomes a central figure in the important bridge between the photographic circles and central hubs of Paris and New York. She was born in Springfield, Ohio, and in 1918 moved to New York, where she studied sculpture independently, meeting and she met people like Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray, who were leaders of the avant-garde. In 1921, she moved to Paris and continued to study sculpture there, and later in Berlin before she returned to Paris to become Man Ray's studio assistant, where she would master photography. When she came back to New York in 1929, she was struck by the rapid transformation of the built landscape. On the eve of the Great Depression, she began a series of documentary photographs of the city that had support from the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. So she photographed from 1935 to 1939, and it debuted in 1939 as a traveling exhibition and a publication called Changing New York. You can see her use of light, her use of structuralism, and a bit of romanticism. This is Penn Station, which looks nothing like this anymore. She also photographed people like Edward Hopper in 1948, the painter, of course, known for Nighthawks, which is what that's called, and also is getting a lot of attention in memes right now on the internet about social distancing, because in all of his work, the figures are standing apart from other people and kind of staring out into space, isolated from each other. So the last important thing about Bernice Abbott is she championed the work of a sort of relatively unknown photographer named Eugene Atget. Although people knew who he was, but I'll get to him in a minute. But it was in 1925 at Man Ray's studio that Abbott first saw photographs by Atget. And then in 1927, she collaborated with Julien Levy of New York's Julien Levy Gallery to buy most of his negatives and prints and bring them back to New York in 1929. Her initiative presented the archive of his Fin de Siècle, French photographer studio, which, given its influence on the avant-garde, has become an important chapter of her legacy. So she really held on to his work and presented it much further than he was able to in his own lifetime. This is a photograph that she made of him a few weeks before his death in 1927. He was 70 years old, and you can see he's looking a little worse for wear. But it became part of her practice to pursue the preservation and promotion of his work. With contributions from friends, she bought all these negatives and prints and began making American photographers and collectors aware of his achievements. Otherwise, he most likely would have sort of fallen into obscurity in France. So who was he? Eugene Atget took up photography in the late 1880s and supplied studies for painters, architects, and stage designers. He began shooting Paris in 1898 using a view camera, a 4x5 camera, to capture the city in detail. His photographs, many were taken at dawn, where you see that sort of glowing light always coming, and are notable. The diffuse light with the wide views give a sense of space and ambiance. They also are documenting Paris and its rapid changes. Many of the areas Atget photographed would soon, after he photographed them, be razed as part of a massive modernization project. He made a modest living, sort of on the margins of photography, taking small assignments from the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Archives Photographiques du Palais Royal, the Société d'Iconographie Parisienne, and others. Sorry for my poor pronunciation. And he would sell prints door to door to decorators, shop owners, and artists in need of source material. His resources were limited, technique was antiquated and awkward. He took up photography in the late 1880s and supplied studies. That's what I told you about. So here you see a photograph of a newsstand, Boulevard de la Madeleine. They are often, my notes here are screwed up, but there's a lot of problems, such as slow shutter speeds, halation stuff, weird sort of photographic moments, along with that wonderful dawn light of an empty street space. He also did a series of storefront windows, photographing through the windows where you get the reflections across the street. And to our modern eye, this looks, sort of simple, but this really excited the surrealists, and Man Ray in particular. And this is why he gets hailed as a great master down the road, is because these, and especially they're called the vitrines in his work. The light resulted from masterful technique. The intermingling spaces, objects, and tones of black simultaneously merge and disjoint the photograph into the real and the reflected, making it a photo championed by the surrealists and their love to explore the connection between fiction and reality. I don't have this up here, but one image he took of a corset shop was used by surrealists on the cover of their magazine as an account of a dream where the corset-dressed mannequin comes alive with connotations of sexuality and violence. Very surrealist thought. And this is the Versailles Coin de Parc. And again, that glowing light. So now moving across the country, where I've been talking a lot about New York, but what was happening in California? So by 1932, there's a group called Group F64. It's founded in Oakland, California, and lasted for 3 years, from the 32 to 35, with this idea of straight, modernistic, and precisionist aesthetic, which was an alternative. One of the things that they really bounced off the New York school was Stieglitz had an urban bias against the natural West Coast, and the West Coast artists are photographing a lot of nature, these landscapes, and of course the most famous founder of this group is Ansel Adams, and I'll talk about him in a minute. They had their own gallery in San Francisco, Gallery 683, which was sort of the equivalent to Stieglitz's Gallery 291 in New York. And the 7 founders were Edward Weston, Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham, Willard Van Dyke, Sonia Noshgowiak, John Paul Edwards, and Henry Swift. I'm going to be focusing today on Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, and Imogen Cunningham. So starting with Ansel Adams, in some regard it almost seems silly to talk about him because we see him in every dentist's office, but he actually, his work has sort of become almost a cliche of what photography is, and a bit of a running joke. He actually has very, very significant contributions to the field, and it's important to talk about him. So he was born in 1902 and dies in 1984, and he actually was trained as a concert pianist, but he really fell in love with photography as a child at age 12 when he was given his first camera on a trip to Yosemite National Park. He helped found MoMA's photography department and developed the zone system with Fred Archer in the late 30s. If I was with you, I'd ask you if you all knew what the zone system was, but I'm going to do a very smash and grab job of trying to explain it to you in the next slide. But the basic is that it's a more scientific control over all phases of photography, from shooting to printing, and an understanding of tonal range. And one of Ansel Adams' biggest things was how he could print. So add that when he went to Yosemite, that gave him this lifelong passion for environmental conservation, which is really tied into his practice. His first work that he was able to publish was as a member of the Sierra Club, and later he was contracted with the United States Department of the Interior to make photographs of national parks, and later he was awarded a Presidential Medal of Freedom a few years before his death for his persistent advocacy, which amazingly helped to expand the national park system to really preserve these areas. But it's more complicated than that. So let's start with the zone system. As you see here, there's these 10 gradient scale. And the zone system, it's a photographic technique for determining optical film exposure and development. So he divided up the range between white and black into 10 zones, going from zone 0 to zone 10. And each zone is an f-stop apart. Color film and digital tend to have fewer zones, but we're not talking about that right now. But it still works with color and digital. But what's important is understanding how these zones relate to one another and how they change as they go through each step of the photographic process. So from 1920 through the 60s, the zone system usually required sort of weird development, and people were often developing sheet film one shot at a time, printed on what were fixed contrast papers. So it was a pain. We didn't have they didn't used to use filters and what we call multi-contrast paper, like what you guys are probably more familiar with in the darkroom. In the 70s through today, the zone system for film became more involved with printing. So it originally was used for shooting, where you try and find like a middle gray. And sorry, this is probably confusing. But as people tended to shoot rolls of film rather than films, you develop them all at once. You would use this sort of technique to print on variable contrast papers, and it made it a little simpler to understand. And it was in 1916 when he first visited Yosemite with his Brownie camera, and after that he returned every summer. He became a mountaineer and conservationist, and the irony is that these grand images, while his intention was to preserve this beauty, this natural beauty, that there was a boom, and it actually inspired more tourism to these areas, which in turn caused more deterioration. But then sort of the rebound is that it did help to create these national parks, which are now this amazing series of wonderful nature that's all preserved. And it was in 1930 that he met Paul Strand, and after seeing his negatives, devoted his life to photography. His earliest images were pictorialist, but then he moved on to this sort of modernist view of nature with this very, very saturated, wonderful, even contrast that he's able to print with. He said the negative is a score and the print is the performance. So he's very, very devoted to the darkroom. A lot of his work is sort of inspired directly from Carlton E. Watkins, who we talked about probably over a month ago, who was one of these post-Civil War photographers who went out west and photographed Yosemite beforehand. And you can see this sort of comparison here. And again, that amazing tonal quality, Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. So the next part of this group of F-64 I'd like to talk about is, text messages, is Edward Weston, who lived from 1886 to 1956, also got his first camera at the age of 16, and he ran a portrait studio of soft focus pictorial style images before he discovered modernism. He met the New York City modernists on a trip in 1922, moved to Mexico City with Tina Modotti in 1923, and these tight compositions of non-essential purity, a concept of pre-visualization. And he was the first photographer to receive a Guggenheim grant. He gave up his soft focus lens in exchange for something more sharp. You can kind of see the soft focus lens on the left where it's the toilet, and then on the right there's this bedpan that is more about the shape and form of it. And he was interested in simplifying the subject by eliminating background, favoring the tight compositions, and he simplified the darkroom by not making enlargements. And he spent 2 weeks studying the toilet bowl. So he was really influenced by this popular philosopher, Henri Bergson, who had this sort of theory of the life force, the pure essence of existence. And his ability to transform landscapes, portraits, and still lifes into visual enigmas. He said the camera should be used for a recording of life, for rendering the very substance and quintessence of the thing itself, whether it be polished steel or palpitating flesh. And you'll see often in his work this amazing ability to make, say, a pepper look like the human form, or a nude look like organic shape of a pepper, or a halved artichoke or a cabbage, and that is that life force. So he didn't really care about subject matter, but it was the repudiated form follows function, which is a very modernist idea. And so it's that life force, that pure essence of existence. When he went to Mexico with Tina Modotti, who is a model and an activist, and I'll talk about her in a minute, and his apprentice and lover, but he created these day books that were essentially a visual diary where he would write about his experiences and everything. And he wrote in his day books a scene of parts, fragments as universal symbols. So creating separatists. This was some landscape work made possible by Guggenheim, and of course there's this nude and the landscape both mimicking each other. And there's some that are even greater than this that I couldn't find slides of. Another landscape. Here he is on location. So after he lived in Mexico, he moved back to California and lived in Carmel, which is right by Point Lobos and Big Sur and all of this sort of amazing seaside landscape, which again he transmits into something that's so much beyond what the landscape is. Where Weston is sort of showing Adams is showing the sort of grandeur and the expanse. Weston is looking at shape and form. And this is Tina Modotti, photographed by Weston, 2 photographs. And he wrote on October 4th, 1924, in his day books, "Tina sat to me yesterday morning. We had long planned that I should do her as I have often seen her, quoting poetry, to attempt the registration of her remarkably mobile face in action. There was nothing forced in the attempt. She was soon in a mood which discounted me and my camera, or did she subconsciously feel my presence and respond to it? Within 20 minutes, I had made 36 Graflex negatives and caught her sensitive face with its every subtle change." So Tina Modotti, who I mentioned they were lovers, and she really was his apprentice. She was an Italian-born artist. She immigrated to the United States when she was 16. She acted in plays and silent films and worked as a model in her first years in the country, which is how she met Edward Weston, who mentored her and was a big influence on her subsequent work. And by 1921, they had become lovers. And in 1923, they moved together to Mexico City, which was, at the time, a cosmopolitan center in the interwar years. There was a lot of expatriates moving there, like Weston and Modotti, but Sergei Eisenstein, Trotsky. So they moved in those circles and intellectuals as well as artists such as Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, who are pretty big names in the world. They opened a portrait studio in the gallery in the city to make money, but her work, it blended a formal rigor with social awareness, and so she was very interested in this the socialist concerns. With her camera, she captured Mexico's sights and people, and she took it folk art landscapes as a starting point for her most abstract images. And here you see this is a bandolier, corn, and the sickle eye. So it's referencing the sickle being both for the worker, which is the same thing in the Russian flag, the symbol of the worker, as well as the bandolier of bullets for the revolutionary. And here is sights of Mexico, woman and water jug. And the last person I'm going to show you today, so I guess this is a little shorter, is Imogen Cunningham, who my daughter is named after. My daughter is Imogen. That's who I named her after. But she is working, she's influenced by Gertrude Casebier, who I don't remember if I showed you her work, but she was part of the pictorialist movement, working in New York around the turn of the century. Imogen Cunningham she took up photography in 1901, and began as a romantic pictorialist and never really gave up that idea of the romanticism. But she would move between subjects. So her subject may be a botanical succulent, like a magnolia blossom. Well, not a succulent here, but which is all like similar to Georgia O'Keeffe, where it's these sort of sexual undertones, but really about the form as well. Or it might be a naked lover or a nude. So it's whether it's presenting the sensual human body or the interior stamen of a flower, the message is not that of sex for the sake of shocking the viewer, but rather to acknowledge the sensual and energetic pulse that runs through all life. A similar intention to that of her contemporaries like Georgia O'Keeffe. And Cunningham, her work as a photographer insightfully spans an entire century. She died in the 70s, but was born, I believe, in the late 1880s, so she was quite old. And it moved through all developments of modern photography. Here you see a photograph of her, I believe the man who became her husband, and I'm forgetting his name, who's an artist. So there is that idea of sensuality in here, as well as using nudes and composition, as well as more direct portraiture. And what she says about her portraiture is, one must be able to gain an understanding at short notice and close range of the beauties of character, intellect, and spirit, so as to be able to draw out the best qualities and make them show in the outer aspect of the sitter. Which I just love this portrait so much. She also would photograph things. This is Fugal Ventilators, 1934, and the focus on the geometric compositions led modernism into the documentary realism of the 1930s, which we're actually going to get into with the next lecture, which should be next week. Again, that modernist approach, the form of the trees, or a leaf pattern. And so that is what I have for you today. One thing I forgot to read to you, I'll just read it to you, is the F-64 Manifesto. Just because I have a little time, and I had it all printed out. So the Group F-64, they wrote a manifesto about their practice. And so the name of this, this is what it says. The name of this group is derived from a diaphragm number of the photographic lens. It signifies to a large extent the qualities of clearness and definition of the photographic image, which is an important element in the work of members of this group. The chief object of the group is to present in frequent shows what it considers the best contemporary photography of the West. In addition to the showing of the work of its members, it will include prints from other photographers who evidence tendencies in their work similar to that of the group. Group F-64 is not pretending to cover the entire spectrum of photography or to indicate through its selection of members any deprecating opinion of the photographers who are not included in its shows. There are great numbers of serious workers in photography whose style and technique does not relate to the métier of the group. Group 64 limits its members and invitational names to those who are striving to define photography as an art form by simple and direct presentation. Through purely photographic methods, the group will show no work at any time that does not conform to its standards of pure photography. Pure photography is defined as possessing no qualities of technique, composition, or idea, derivative of any other art form. The production of the pictorialist, on the other hand, indicates a devotion to principles of art which are directly related to painting and the graphic arts. The members of Group F-64 believe that photography as an art form must develop along the lines defined by the actualities and limitations of the photographic medium, and must always remain independent of ideological conventions of art and aesthetics that are reminiscent of a period in culture antedating the growth of the medium itself. The group will appreciate information regarding any serious work in photography that has escaped its attention and is favorable toward establishing itself as a form of modern photography. So the idea of clarity and being a purely photographic process. So I hope that's helpful. I hope it fills in. You should have read that chapter now, which is chapter 11, which has a lot of this, and some more artists like Hans Bellmer and Mortensen, who are pushing these other ideas of modernism outside of the world of that sort of combining fashion and studio work. with this idea of modernism. The next class lecture will be on social documentary as we move into the Great Depression and pre-World War II and into World War II. So you should read chapter 12 and chapter 13 by next class. And so, as I said, I told you this last class, but this is going to be, this is the end of this block, so you should write a 3-page paper on pictorialism and modernism, on any subject of your choosing. It could be on an artist, it could be on a comparison between pictorialism and modernism, and it could be anything. If you have any questions, please email me. I will send out an email probably right now. And I'm going to try and send out all of this right now so you have it, and see if I can deal with any technical glitches. All right. So again, be well. I hope to hear from you soon. I'm going to give you my phone number if you guys need to text or call with any problems, because this is a confusing place to be, not just for you, for everybody. And I'll talk to you guys later. All right. Have a good one.